Janos Kass was born in Szeged, Hungary in 1927, and that's all I can tell you about him with any confidence until he enrolled at the Applied Art Academy in 1942 at the age of 15. And for reasons best known to himself, he studied ceramics. But having completed that course, he subsequently started another in graphic art in 1946 at the Hungarian School of Fine Arts, and he didn't emerge from there until 1951. In 1953, the first evidence of his professional work appeared in the form of an illustrated edition of Miguel Cervantes' Tale of Don Quixote, and it was a remarkably accomplished debut into the arena of narrative illustration, demonstrating formidable control of expressive calligraphic line. His subtle distortion of human anatomy, manifestly based on observation, was just enough to give his figures abundant personality without the use of overt caricature. The images were mostly character studies of the eponymous hero or small groups of figures, and as such they were largely devoid of background, although Kass's evocation of the iconic tilting at windmills scene cleverly incorporated that vital element into a sparse but well-composed double-page spread. He followed this in 1955 with a Hungarian translation of Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper, and in this instance Kass's conspicuously static images of the characters were in colour, applied as fairly flat selective washes to the fine expressively executed ink line work. And this tendency to favour formal posing of his subjects in both his art and illustration would be an abiding feature of his work for the rest of his career. His most often used process for his printmaking was etching, but there were also quite a few lithographs created in which he revealed similar levels of prowess. His influences were various and appeared intermittently at different stages of his career, but at this time the most obvious and enduring inspirations were the two great masters of 20th century modern art, Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso, both of whom were able to create highly expressive figure work with the bare minimum of embellishment. But it was also at this time that he started to design posters for various Hungarian films, and he continued to produce quite a few more throughout the decade. All of these posters were particularly eye-catching, and although the levels of representation in the anatomy of his figures varied considerably, they were nevertheless united by their angular graphic qualities, use of limited colour palettes, and a general disregard for what might be considered scene setting, in favour of more symbolic and occasionally enigmatic image creation. Strangely, the available evidence indicates that by the later years of the decade he had completely abandoned such poster work. In 1966 he also illustrated Toldi, an epic poem by Janos Kass, originally written in 1846. And although I didn't find many examples to show, those I did find were, like the earlier Prince and Pauper book, deceptively simple close-quarter character studies in line and colour. In the same year, Kass's illustrated edition of Imre Madak's 1861 play The Tragedy of Man was also published. As you might guess from the title, this wasn't the most uplifting, optimistic, dramatic work, but it was undoubtedly one of his most creatively successful, and in Hungary at least its popularity has endured. What was particularly significant about the complex etchings he created was the incorporation of peripheral imagery which formed a constellation around the main scene. But there had been some form of breakdown in communication between Kass and the publishers, because he created the images on copper plates bigger than the actual print size. And unfortunately the book edition cropped these peripheral elements out, so they were only found on the prints he created. This was a pity, as in their complete form they had the advantage of speaking with greater visual eloquence than usual about the subtexts and metaphors used in this enactment of man's fall from grace. Following this monumental creative success, 1969 saw the publication of a Folio Society edition of Émile Zola's novel Thérèse Raquin. An apparently reliable source refers to these character drawings as being created as lithographs, and who am I to doubt it? But why you would opt to make life much harder than it needs to be to create such images when the end results look for all the world like pen and ink with a single flat blue overlay, I have no idea. Having said that, the quality of his line work, whether created on paper or stone, leaves the rest of us mere mortals, and certainly this one, slap-jawed with admiration. And they formed an elegant and expressive visualisation of Zola's tragic narrative. I found just a couple of images created by Kass in 1970, including an example of an ex libris design, and another image of the biblical tale of Noah's Ark. But in 1971 his colour illustrations for a book of verse for children titled The King of the Jungle, written by Szeged-born Ferenc Mora, was published. Although Mora had died not long before Kass was born, his playful rhymes obviously resonated with the illustrator, and the exceptionally jolly and daringly abstracted colour images he produced were laid out on each double-page spread with the relevant verse to considerable effect. Kass's approach to this project was virtually unrecognisable from the more sober, elegant drawings he had created for his work for adults. And in this context, the influence of Hungarian folk art was well to the fore in his execution. By this time, of course, it wasn't unusual for children's illustrators around the world to be creating similarly abstracted work. Kass's freewheeling and highly entertaining images were nevertheless a distinctive and worthy example of radical styling in illustration for small children. Despite his obvious growing immersion in the production of images for books for both adults and children, he continued with success to pursue his parallel art career. And to that end, in 1974, he produced a series of prints on the theme of the biblical character Moses. Being Jewish himself, the Old Testament seems to have been a never-ending source of inspiration for his invariably dignified and unsentimental images. A year later he illustrated Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, both written by Mark Twain a century earlier. But unfortunately all the evidence I could find were the covers and this isolated colour page illustration. In the same year, Kass returned to the tragedy of man, this time with an astonishingly small book format of just 6 by 4 centimetres. Why it was published so small I have no idea, but the size of the images meant that Kass's etchings had to be drastically simpler than those created almost a decade earlier. But despite this serious limitation, the images he produced had their own more direct aesthetic appeal. It was during the 1970s that Kass created several more ex libris bookplates, mostly for his friends and acquaintances, but it was never what could be considered a significant part of his output. The picture book Spring is Blooming by Zoltán Zelt was published in 1976. Like all Kass's work for children, it was a joyously anarchic collection of double-page spreads guaranteed to attract and hold the interest of young readers, with line and bright colour applied in the distinctively folk art influenced style he employed for his children's books. And a year later he followed this with entirely similar images and layouts for Żelki Alto, which doesn't seem to translate as anything at all, so I'm guessing it's a name, written by Tamko Sirato Karoy. It was an equally entertaining and absorbing collection of whimsical images, which harnessed the way children themselves visualise the world, but with the added creative control acquired in later life. Somehow he also managed to make time for his career in art, and that too remained as popular as ever, even if with an entirely different clientele. And in the later 1970s, among his more commercial commissions was the production of various series of postage stamps, all of which were again highly decorative and themed for children's culture. Among them was a collection using characters from well-known fairy tales. I searched for quite some time, but I found no record of him having actually illustrated the stories in book form, which is a great pity. But in 1979 he returned to serious-minded fiction for adults with more fine line drawings for an edition of Ivan Turgenev's 1861 novel Fathers and Sons. And as they look identical in their execution to the earlier Thérèse Racan images, I imagine that they too were created lithographically. This was another edition published by the Folio Society, which specialised in classic books visualised by the finest illustrators of the age, and Kass more than deserves such a prestigious and international commission. A year later he turned his attention to the work of William Shakespeare, and specifically the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. He created a collection of images using a combination of etching and aquatint, which also incorporated his handwritten texts, which as far as I can tell were printed as a limited edition set. I certainly can't find any evidence of them being published as a book, even though they look remarkably like a superior graphic novel. In 1981, while spending time in London, Kass collaborated with the Hungarian-born Janos Kass on a groundbreaking 10-minute animated sequence titled Dilemma. It combined Kass's painted images with digitally generated elements and was simply accompanied by a musical soundtrack. Unfortunately, this poor resolution sequence is the best I could find. 1981 was also the year he published another set of striking prints, and in this instance one source asserts that they were silkscreen prints, which is certainly what they look like, but another refers to them as lithographs. However they were collected under the general title of Lord Bluebeard's Castle, and where his Hamlet images have been gloriously complex and layered, these could not have been more direct and posterised, but no less compelling or attractive for that. In 1983, Kass created another collection of images, possibly in pen and ink, but given earlier evidence possibly as lithographs, to accompany the Psalmus Hungaricus, a rewritten version of Psalm 55, by the 16th century poet Mihi Veg. They were striking examples of the more visually impulsive end of his stylistic approach, using a wide range of line work from finely described detail to larger gestural strokes of considerable energy, and selective colour was added with equal disregard for representation. In 1985, Kass created a series of etched and aquatinted portraits of famous doctors from history, and although I don't know if that's why he created them, they did surface as a collection of postage stamps in 1987. And it was also in 1985 that he returned to biblical themes with a series of etchings based on moments from the Old Testament. They were particularly monumental and suggestive of sculpture in their execution, and like the earlier tragedy of man, he also incorporated peripheral visual elements around the main image, although much more formally than before. In the following year he returned to children's book, for Elizabeth Odsvat's The Lucky Little Thing, with some endearing and deceptively naive line and wash pictures. But from this point on, and for quite a few years to come, it seems Kass put his illustration very much on the back burner, and throughout the later 1980s and all of the 90s, it was with his work as a printmaking artist that he was exclusively occupied. Some persisted with images inspired by his faith, such as this 1992 series of particularly finely executed and etched figure-based images, each one representing a particular Jewish festival. But in fairly stark contrast, a lot of other images he produced later in the decade revealed more explanation of the abiding influence of the gestural simplicity found in the work of his modern art mentors Picasso and Matisse. And it wasn't until 2000 that he returned to illustration with a collection for the children's book The Adventures of Miso Squirrel, using just a rusty brown and black two-colour combination with some typically charming energetic images. And then in 2002, Kass started to create a large volume of particularly playful images for a series of educational books for younger children. These were all rendered in what might be called his more conventional children's style, by which I mean that although far from classically representational, they were more broadly accessible and mainstream than some of his more outlandish children's book depictions. By now well into his 70s, it may well be that he finally retired, but I found no other work, art or illustration later than this, and Janos Kass died in 2010 at the age of 83. Although I doubt that many viewers would have previously heard of this remarkably talented and prolific man, I'm pleased to say that in Hungary at least, he remains both respected and well known. Kass is yet another remarkable figure I wish I had known about much earlier, but my new mantra is better late than never, and if this tribute to his life and work has any impact on you the viewer, I'll consider it a job well done.